This episode is brought to you by the Council for Exceptional Children, the largest international professional organization dedicated to high-quality education that is inclusive and equitable for individuals with disabilities and/or gifts and talents. Learn more at exceptionalchildren.org.
It's not pass-fail. It's just whatever their experience is what it is.
Life is not pass-fail. I love that you said that. I'm like, ooh, that's so good. Like, nothing is pass-fail. There's all different sort of intensities, and it's like the spectrum, right? When we talk about the autism spectrum, life is the same sort of way.
How much does biology influence behavior? And how can parents and educators support kids who struggle with emotional regulation? The research coming out now and influencing how we parent and teach neurodivergent kids is changing the status quo, and that's a good thing. Today's guest, Penny Williams, is the host of the Beautifully Complex podcast and author of The Boy Without Instructions. She's here today to talk about parenting neurodivergent kids. That's straight ahead on episode 156. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
As a listener to this podcast, you already know how important it is that we shift the way the world sees neurodiversity. If you want to help us move that mission forward, one super easy thing that you can do is leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast app. Just doing that one little thing helps us reach more listeners every day. And of course, you can keep sharing about the podcast with your friends and family by sending them a link or sharing our social media page or talking about it the next time you see them. And if you accidentally sent out a reply all to your entire company about the podcast, that would be okay with us. Anyway, thanks for being here. Penny Williams is up next.
On a previous episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast,
we're saying like they're intense and they need to know and they have a drive to know and they won't stop until they figure out everything and they feel so many things. And so there was only one explanation at one point, that is overexcitability, posited by Kazimierz Dabrowski, a Polish psychologist in the 60s. And that was the only theory that could explain that. And that theory has very little empirical support. And so in the light of the little empirical support and the observations that so many people were making, in the sense that this is happening. So if you're telling me that this theory doesn't have a lot of support, then what explanation are you giving me for this?
that's episode 147. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, we're talking with Penny Williams. Penny is the author of several books, including The Boy Without Instructions, and she is also the host of the podcast Beautifully Complex, Navigating Neurodiverse Parenting. So, Penny, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
This journey of parenting neurodivergent kids is one that most of us didn't expect, or maybe if we did expect it, we don't really know what it's like until we get into it.
Yeah.
How did you react to the experience of realizing you were on this journey of parenting a neurodivergent child?
So my first inclination was to fix it, right? I think so many parents start there because we can't stand to see our kids struggle. We can't stand to have them not fit in. Right. And so my first inclination absolutely was I'm going to research. I'm going to read every book known to man and I'm going to figure this out. Right. I'm going to help this kid. And it actually caused me to be really stuck for a couple of years and not making any progress because we can't fix our kids. There's nothing to fix. We have to figure out how to help them navigate our neurotypical world with a neurodivergent brain. And so I had to learn how to override that sort of type A fix-it doer that I am, and recognize that I had to come at it from a totally different perspective.
I feel like anytime there's that growth in our lives, it's sometimes a little bit painful.
Yeah.
And trying to come to that realization and going, okay, this isn't something that I'm going to get a recipe and find the ingredients and the process, and then we're going to go through those steps and it's going to be done. And it's not that simple.
Mm-hmm.
How did your evolution kind of influence your relationship with your child and just kind of how you viewed all of that?
Yeah, my relationship with my child got better the more I worked to really understand and accept. That acceptance was a huge piece of it. And that was not only accepting that I couldn't fix it, but accepting that it's okay to move through the world with differences. It's even fantastic. And that we're all individuals. So I really had to take this journey of acceptance to come to a point where I realized that I was raising an individual. And so I needed to do that in a way that honored that he was an individual, right? That things are different for him. And I know that we've all heard these phrases like, if you've met one kid with autism, you've met one kid with autism or ADHD. It's kind of interchangeable. And that is profound, really. Like, we really need to sit in that and embrace that and come at this parenting from that place, because the mistakes that we make and the pitfalls that we fall into are those that come from traditional parenting and neurotypical expectations of our kids. And so when we realize that this is an individual kid and I have to do it in a way that works for their individuality, it's a big point of clarity, at least it was for me.
A lot of people can probably relate to that experience and that process of going through that. Also recognizing that there's not always necessarily just a finish line, like it's a process, it's ongoing. Mm-hmm. There are times when that internalized ableism from society is going to kind of sink into our psyche and we have to kind of work our way out of it again. You know, it kind of comes and goes.
Oh, yeah. I think that there's a grief process to it. And sometimes we feel like we've passed that point, but it comes back up. It bubbles to the surface. You know, my son is 20 now. We've been on this journey since he was 6 years old, really before that, but that's when we got the first diagnosis. And so that grief bubbles up again sometimes. You know, it's hard to see your kid struggle, and we just have to get better at managing it appropriately and accepting it and acknowledging it, not stuffing it down, not feeling that guilt and shame about it, right? That we're so good as parents of putting on ourselves so much shame and blame and guilt.
I think because of the stigma that surrounds neurodiversity, there are just a lot of myths that people believe about parenting neurodivergent kids. Mm-hmm. And, you know, one of the myths that I think you just already mentioned was about that there's going to be a way to fix the situation or the child, which just isn't accurate. Are there any other myths that you feel like you hear people talking about that you'd like to dispel?
Yeah, that fixing it is definitely my number one always when I'm asked this question. The second thing I think is a big myth is around sort of authoritarian parenting and what I call crime and punishment. If you give the child a painful enough consequence, they will not repeat the behavior, right? But one is true for neurotypicals and not kids, especially with impulse control problems. And two, really isn't the best way to parent in the first place, neurodivergent or not.
Right.
And so we just sort of get stuck there, right? We double down on it instead of just sitting back and saying, hey, maybe I can do this differently. Maybe there's another way, because we're conditioned as we grow up and through adulthood until we're parents, we're conditioned to think that you set rules, your kid breaks them, you punish, right? And for neurodivergent kids, it's not that simple. And I just think there's a better way to parent anyway, because we know that behavior is communication. And by using that lens and understanding the brain that our kid has, we then are led to do things differently. We realize that there's other ways to go about it, but we often do get stuck in that myth that parenting is just this crime and punishment. I mean, that's our society too, right? So we're really sort of flooded with that notion, and we have to be able to step out of it. So I think that's a big one. And this sort of doubling down, like if I just stick to it, if I keep enforcing these boundaries, eventually my kid's going to fall in line.
Right.
Not if it doesn't work for them.
If it were that simple, it wouldn't be, we wouldn't be asking the question. We wouldn't be struggling with it.
Nobody would ever make mistakes and bad choices, right? If it was that simple.
Yes.
But we do, because we're human.
Are there any others that stand out to you about just some of those inaccurate beliefs about neurodiversity?
Yeah. And I think it's not necessarily specific to neurodiversity, but it becomes a pitfall when we have neurodiverse kids, because I hear parents so often say, well, my kid has to learn to blank.
Mm-hmm.
My kid has to learn to take care of himself. My kid has to learn to clean up after himself. My kid has to learn to tie his shoes before he graduates high school. Like, I hear all of these things because it's our fear as parents bubbling up to the surface, right? And so we have to learn to sort of soften those expectations. Yes, my kid has to learn to take care of himself, but he doesn't have to have all those skills at 8 years old.
Right.
He doesn't have to have all those skills at 18 years old.
Yeah.
He will get there when he gets there. That's the neurodivergent piece that I think is so crucial. And I teach parents to always say yet at the end of these statements. My kid hasn't learned to take care of himself yet.
Mm-hmm.
My kid hasn't learned to tie his shoes yet. Just because he's 8 and he doesn't tie his shoes doesn't mean he never will. And even if he never will, that's okay. It's totally okay if he never learns to tie his shoes. He can be happy in this world and work around shoe tying, I promise.
Mm-hmm.
It's those sort of things we just get stuck there because we have that fear and that worry for our kids. And so that's one of those myths that, like, if they don't do it when everybody else does it, then maybe they're never going to do it. And then, oh my gosh, what's going to happen if they never get there? And in my experience, they just get there in their own time.
It's really about moving from an either or to a both and.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be now or never. They're working on it. And just because somebody says this is the average age or whatever, it's not pass fail. It's just whatever their experience is what it is.
Life is not pass fail. I love that you said that. I'm like, ooh, that's so good. Like,
yeah,
it's everything. Nothing is pass fail. There's all different sort of intensities, and it's like the spectrum, right? When we talk about the autism spectrum, life is the same sort of way. And I think it's that pass-fail mentality that gets us stuck and gets our kids stuck.
I love the research that's really coming out as we start to really understand the interconnectedness between biology and behavior. And I know this is an area that you are very passionate about too.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that you're learning about within this process that just have really kind of changed how you view some things?
So much. This has probably been the biggest aha in my parenting in 14 years. And unfortunately, I came to it pretty late. You know, I learned from Ross Green pretty early on that behavior is communication. It's a signal. But when a couple of years ago, I added in this layer of what we know from polyvagal theory, which is very scientific, but about the autonomic nervous system. You know, a lot of behavior is instinctual and automatic. We don't choose it or control it. And the example that I like to use is anxiety, because I have a lot of anxiety myself, and I get very distinct physical signals when I'm getting anxious, right? My stomach hurts, my skin gets tingly sometimes. I sometimes feel dizzy, like depending on the degree of anxiety I'm having. And that's my autonomic nervous system saying danger. It's setting off an alarm. And I have to then figure out, is it a rational, real fear, or was it a false alarm, right? And this is something our kids are having to do. And a lot of our neurodivergent kids have a much more sensitive alarm in their bodies. They just have a more sensitive nervous system. And so they're getting these signals. They may not be recognizing them and being able to regulate them, because some of them are automatic, but also because they don't have those skills yet for those that they can regulate. So the more we know about that interconnectedness, now I get it when my son would, start screaming at me when he didn't feel safe, right? I didn't see that he didn't feel safe, that that's what was really going on for a long time. But then I could understand that, okay, his system is wired to protect him and to keep him safe. And if that includes psychological safety, we're not just talking about physical safety. And thinking about that, like that, learning that after my son's freshman year in high school, all the bells went off, all the light bulbs went off, right? Because this is exactly what was happening to him, is he never felt safe. He always felt sort of under siege just in that environment and what was going on around him. And we didn't know about this interconnectedness. I didn't understand the autonomic nervous system yet. But when I learned, boy, I was like, it all makes sense, right? Every bit of it made sense. And we just come at behavior, both parents and educators, I think adults in general that are in kids' lives, we look at behavior as a choice and an intention, and then we label it good or bad, right? So if it was a good choice by our standards, which again is not concrete, right? It's all relative and open to interpretation, then we get in that mindset that there is good and bad behavior. And what we teach at the Behavior Revolution is that there's not good and bad behavior. There's regulated behavior and dysregulated behavior. And when we look at it that way, now we're like, okay, what's going on in their body? What's going on in their brain? How does their brain and body interpret this? How does it respond? Now we get it. And now we can really give our kid what they need instead of making assumptions like it's intentional or they're just trying to give me a hard time. Now we get that that isn't the case. What's happening is their body is going danger, danger, and it's doing something to try to protect them. Or, they're getting these signals, but they don't know what to do with them. And we actually created a behavior wheel, and I can provide it for you for free download for your audience if you want. It outlines those 3 different kind of states of that nervous system and then different behaviors that you would see in each. So if your kid is kind of jumping out of their skin is what I call it, like they just need to move and they're really struggling with being still and they're really struggling with being calm, that's really a signal that they're kind of in that fight or flight zone. And what we know about that as far as the nervous system now is that they need to move. Like their body is telling them they need to move because they sense danger. And as the adult and caregiver seeing that, now we're able to really do the right thing for them because we get it on that deeper level and on that scientific level.
More in a minute.
Special educators are the front line in our efforts to impact the lives of neurodivergent individuals. That's why it's so important that our special educators are trained and up to date on curriculum and programs designed to help neurodivergent kids. If you're a special or gifted educator, consider attending the Council for Exceptional Children Annual Convention and Expo March 1st through 4th, 2023 in Louisville, Kentucky. CEC's event will include literally hundreds of sessions on just about every topic in the field of educating neurodivergent students. The CEC Convention and Expo is the professional development event for special educators to find research, tips, and strategies that you can actually apply to supporting students with disabilities and/or gifts and talents. Attendees go home with ideas and strategies and often a whole new network of colleagues to help each other grow. Our podcast will be attending, and you can find us in the Expo Hall, and I will be a presenter. Learn more, register, and plan your schedule at cecconvention.org. See you in Louisville. It's always good to kind of reflect on current things that are going on because it is such a process.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I'm thinking about is, you're describing quite a bit those kids who it sounds like probably have more outward expressions of that dysregulation. Here's really the situation. I'm going to be very straightforward about exactly what happened this morning. So
Go for it.
And because I've been trying to like problem solve through this. So my oldest is 14. He's neurodivergent. I mean, he's definitely ADHD. And although he doesn't have a diagnosis of autism, he's got a lot of those characteristics. He processes information very slowly. He moves very slowly. And I would say, as far as that sensitivity to stimuli, I would say he's more on the hyposensitive side as opposed to the hyper. So this morning, we all, the two adults and him, and actually for what it's worth, he's very good at setting his alarm and getting himself up in the morning.
That's amazing.
Yes. We all overslept. None of the alarms went off. So I woke up and it was still dark outside at 6:40. And I'm like, oh, well, no one's up. He's not going to make the bus. The bus comes at 6:45.
Oh, no.
And so I went in and got him up. But here was the thing. It was fine because school doesn't start till 7:25. It's like really we had plenty of time to get him up and get him going. But he could not adapt. Like he was still late to school because he still had to go through the same routine.
Yep.
And he couldn't adjust. What I have to realize is like, okay, so where do I go with that? And recognizing like, I just know that about him. Like he does everything methodically and slowly. And so then, so what? I guess that's where I am. That's where I've gotten in the last 5 hours.
Yeah. And, you brought up a really good point that sometimes these signals are internal and sometimes we see behaviors that are more internal. So, one that I brought to the behavior wheel was acting like a mother hen, because sometimes kids want to try to fix and diffuse a situation out of their own anxiety and discomfort. And that's them getting activated. So they're not necessarily like jumping out of their skin, they got to move, but they're being activated internally. That sort of internal alarm is going off, right? And I think for your son, he needs that system, that routine, right? To prepare himself for the step of being at school. And it's good that he knows himself that much, I think.
Compared to the other child who we have to drag out of bed every morning, I'll take it.
Yeah. And my question, like when I'm coaching parents, my question would be, well, what's the big deal if he's late today?
Absolutely. I think there would be a lot of parents who would panic about that. I'm like, but this is like a drop in the bucket.
Totally.
But I was sitting there and reflecting, and I was talking to him as I drove him to school. I'm like, we got to figure out a way to like expedite the process a little bit if we're running late. That's just a life skill. Let's be honest.
And that's where I would say yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
It's a life skill, but he's not there yet.
I think one of the biggest things that we can do with kids as well with all of that is just help them learn to communicate about it as much as possible, because the more that they can identify and recognize and communicate those things, not only can they advocate for themselves, also it just helps them to be able to understand something and put it into words, gives you a sense of control over it.
Oh, yeah.
It gives you a sense of awareness or ability to manage a situation.
And that control piece is huge for our neurodivergent kids. So much of behavior comes down to really not having any sense of control. They feel like they have no say. Nobody gets it. Nobody hears them. We talk too much as parents. And so we have to learn to listen more. And sometimes there's long, uncomfortable pauses. But if we wait long enough, our kids are likely to step up and say something else, to maybe start walking down that path of problem solving on their own. And we, again, it's that fix it nature.
Yeah.
We just want to be like, this is what you need to do, get it done. And it doesn't help them in the long term. It sure is easier in the short term, but it doesn't help them in the long term. And getting to know themselves and what they need is crucial for adulthood.
We tend to try to fill in the blanks for them. And then we take away that productive struggle. And sometimes we have to let kids come up with their own solution. And we might say to ourselves in our minds, like, oh, that's a terrible idea. That's never going to work.
Sure.
But we have to give them that freedom to kind of figure it out a little bit. And they'll be able to reflect afterwards and recognize if it worked or didn't. How much more impactful is that for them to have the opportunity to try something and see for themselves that it doesn't work, we want them to have that experience just to know what that's like.
Yeah, I think so many of our kids really struggle with discomfort. My own son, I call him a serial avoider. And it's really that. He really has a very hard time with sitting in discomfort. And that is a skill that we need. There's lots of life that is uncomfortable, and we have to figure out how to help them with that. And part of that is seeing that you can be on the other side of it, like you're describing. You might make a mistake, but it's going to be okay. And next time you might know exactly what to do, and it won't be uncomfortable anymore. But without them having that experience, they just stay stuck in it's too hard, it's too uncomfortable. What if the bad things happen, right? And we know that the brain wires based on our experiences. So the more positive experiences you have, the more you feel confident and competent, the more your brain is wiring in that way. And the negative is the same. So the more kids avoid that discomfort and struggle, and we allow it or we help them avoid it. I mean, I used to be that parent who would try to do everything for him or make it as easy as I possibly could because I wanted to protect him and I didn't want him to feel pain. And I had to realize over time that our kids have to have those experiences or they're never going to be able to manage on their own. They're always going to need someone, right, to fill that role. And it comes back to that control piece that when we allow them to make the choice, even if it was a mistake, or maybe they got to the same place, but it was a lot longer and harder and messier, they still realized that it was their choice to make and they could do it and they could be okay at the other side no matter what happened. And I think that's such a valuable experience, even when our kids are super young. Like, I wish I had really understood that when my kids were much younger.
Well, we always reflect on things, but
shoulda, woulda, coulda.
You work with the tools that you have at the time. It's a process for all of us. I want to do a little activity that I think our listeners will really like. We're going to do just a quick little countdown of your top 3 favorite strategies that parents can put into action right away. Okay, we'll start with number 3 because it's a countdown.
Yep.
So what is number 3 for your top 3 favorite strategies for parents?
I just kind of alluded to it a second ago. Stop talking and listen.
Right.
Stop saying so much. Wait for them to come along to that. And what I mean by that is, like, you give your kid clues, you notice things. I noticed that your backpack is all over the dining room table. All of its contents are spread everywhere. And now the food is ready and I'm trying to, set the table for dinner. But I would just notice, like, I notice your backpack is on the kitchen table and your stuff spread out. And then wait for them to figure out what to do. Don't go, oh, they didn't immediately respond, so I must have to tell them. Just wait, because more often than not, they're going to get there. And when they're trying to tell us something, we have to be listening. We shut down our kids way too much because we assume we understand when typically we actually don't. So we really need to hear it from them.
All right. Tip number 2.
Ask yourself, if it's not this behavior that I'm judging, disrespect, intentional, lazy. So if it's not disrespect, what else could it be? In those parenting moments, because we know most often the way it feels to the adult is not the intention of the child. So we have to learn to open our minds to what else it could be. And then that helps us too to stay in that brain-based lens versus that judgmental behavior-based lens. So if it's not laziness, what else could it be? There are other answers, I promise.
Yeah.
And parents get really stuck here. We get really stuck in what it feels like because it doesn't feel good. If my kid's yelling at me, it doesn't feel good. And so I have to be able to sort of separate from the emotion of it and ask myself, what else could it be?
Yeah, we tend to interpret those things and put context around them without necessarily looking at like the facts or the foundation of what's really going on. Last one. What is your top favorite strategy that parents can put into place?
Another question to ask yourself, am I co-regulating or am I co-escalating? If we're co-escalating, we're not having any positive influence on the situation, right? All we're doing is making it worse. Often the ways that we're wired to respond, because we're wired to respond in kind, as again, that self-protective measure. If you're coming at me and yelling, my brain and my body is telling me to come at you and yell back. And we have to be the one to self-regulate and offer our calm, which is co-regulation. If we can stay calm, our kids can borrow some of that calm, and we're not going to further escalate the situation. So I talk so much about co-escalation versus co-regulation because we have a huge role in our kids' behavior, a huge role. We are often contributing to it. We are often co-regulating because that's our nature as a protection measure. And so one thing that I learned from Robert Cox many moons ago, I think in my very first summit several years ago, who's a therapist in the Midwest, he said, just take a deep empathetic breath before you respond. Don't open your mouth. Don't be reactive. Just take this huge, deep, empathetic breath. And then your child is going to hear in that you feel for them and you want to get it and you want to help them. But you're also getting that moment to think about the way you're going to respond instead of being super reactive. So in that breath, what I have learned to do is always say, my child isn't giving me a hard time. My child is having a hard time. Like that's been my mantra. When I step in the room and it's intense, the first thing I do is take a breath and say, he's not giving me a hard time. He's having a hard time. What is going on for him? And that helps me to be a co-regulating presence instead of co-escalating.
Yeah. Oh, Penny, this has been such a great conversation. So as we wrap up, I want to circle back to where we started our interview. And my last question to you is this. As you look back on your experience when you first began this parenting journey, if you could tell yourself something or give yourself some advice, what do you think you would have wanted or needed to hear?
The first thing that pops into my head is it's going to be okay. And my kid is going to be okay. Your kid's going to be okay. I got chills from that. I got goosebumps. Because I tell you what, in the beginning, it was so hard to see that. I couldn't see it. All I saw was darkness. All I saw was how hard it was. And I really needed somebody to show me that there was light. And it was super hard. And we sort of demonize Facebook and social media at this point for some valid reasons. But if I hadn't joined Facebook and made a group of parents of kids at the time with ADHD, because that was our first diagnosis for many years, I don't know if I would have survived it. I just needed to see other people that were doing it and families where it was getting better for them, which I think is a lot about why I'm so very open about our experience, because I see how empowering that is. And we need that hope. If you're dealing with a 7-year-old kid who, is just bouncing literally off the walls and the ceilings all the time, can't meet expectations, is crying a lot, which by the way was my kid. It was super overwhelming. Plus nothing was going well at school. And that was all I was hearing about. And it was just all this negative, right? We were just consumed by ADHD. And I really needed to know that ADHD wasn't our whole world. It was only a tiny bit of it. And that things were going to progress. He was just a teeny weeny little boy who had no self-regulation yet and a lot of lagging skills. And he needed our help. And I didn't get that message right away. And I think that message is really out there now very concretely, because there's a lot more people doing work online and stuff now. But 14 years ago, when we got this first diagnosis, there was almost nothing There was almost nothing. And so it's really valuable to find your people as a parent, to find the people who get it and who can tell you that it gets better. You know, my kid at 20 is the polar opposite of my kid at 7. And he has grown so much and learned so much regulation and about himself emotionally and, you know, all these things that 10 years ago, even I would have been like, nope, no way, we're never going to get that. That's not reality for us, right? I would have dismissed it. So, you know, I just want everybody listening to know that I see you and I hear you, and it does get better. Some things get harder, but a lot of things get easier. And part of that is us and the work that we do on ourselves as parents too.
Penny Williams, host of the Beautifully Complex podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
I love talking to parents of kids who are older than my own because I love to hear how things have turned out. I have clients in my office who I've been working with for almost a decade, from the time they were in elementary or middle school. They're now heading off to college or are young adults. And when I consider where they were when we started and how far they've come, I smile. Being neurodivergent doesn't go away, but it does change. And there are strengths that come along with the struggles. Helping neurodivergent folks move along their path and seek continual progress is good work, whether you are their parent, their friend, their teacher, or their therapist. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
This episode has been sponsored by the Council for Exceptional Children. Learn more at exceptionalchildren.org. Our thanks to Penny Williams. You can find information about her and her work on the episode page at neurodiversitypodcast.com. Hey, that's also the place you can find our A Little Weird is Good podcast t-shirt. Just click on merchandise at the top of the page. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media guru is Krista Brown. I'm the show's executive producer, Dave Morris, and for all of us here, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.